It is the most recognizable statue on Earth. 73 meters long, 20 meters high, carved from a single ridge of limestone bedrock on the western edge of the Giza plateau, facing due east, staring into the sunrise with an expression that has been described as serene, inscrutable, and, depending on the century and the observer, either welcoming or threatening. It has the body of a lion and the head of a man, and it wears the royal Nemes headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. Its paws stretch forward like a reclining cat. Its haunches rise behind like a crouching predator. It has been buried in sand up to its neck at least 3 times in recorded history. Its nose is missing. Its beard has fallen off. Its original painted surface, red body, blue and yellow headdress, has been scoured away by 45 centuries of wind and sand. And despite being the subject of more speculation, more investigation, and more myth than almost any other object built by human hands, one fundamental question remains unanswered. Who built it? That question sounds absurd. The Sphinx sits at Giza, in the shadow of the 3 most famous pyramids on Earth. The pyramids were built by Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, the 3 great pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. The Sphinx sits directly in front of Khafre's pyramid, aligned with Khafre's causeway, adjacent to Khafre's valley temple. The circumstantial evidence points, overwhelmingly, to Khafre. Most Egyptologists believe Khafre built it. Many guidebooks state it as fact. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that has haunted Egyptology for more than a century. There is not one single contemporary inscription from the 4th dynasty that names the builder of the Sphinx. Not one. Not on the Sphinx itself. Not in Khafre's pyramid complex. Not in any tomb or temple or text from the era in which the Sphinx was supposedly carved. The largest monolithic statue in the ancient world, a sculpture so massive that it is visible from space, was apparently built without anyone writing down who ordered it, who designed it, or why. And it gets stranger. The Sphinx is not just missing its builder's name, it is missing its original name entirely. The word Sphinx is Greek, not Egyptian. The Greeks applied the name centuries after the monument was built, borrowing from their own mythology, the riddle-posing monster of the Oedipus legend. The Egyptians of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, called it Hora-Makhet, Horus of the horizon, and worshipped it as an aspect of the sun god. But what the builders of the 4th dynasty called it, if they called it anything, is unknown. The monument has no birth certificate, no dedication text, no founding inscription. It simply exists, crouched on the bedrock of the Giza plateau, staring east, refusing to reveal its origins. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand every piece of evidence that connects the Sphinx to its possible builders. The archaeological clues, the geological controversies, the scholarly debates that have divided Egyptologists for generations. And you are going to understand why the answer to the simplest question about the most famous statue in the world remains, after more than a century of scientific investigation, stubbornly uncertain. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Consider what we are talking about. A monument carved from the living rock of the Giza plateau, not assembled from blocks like the pyramids, but sculpted in place, subtracted from the bedrock itself. The quarry from which the Sphinx was carved is still visible, the U-shaped trench, or enclosure, that surrounds the body on 3 sides, its walls rising to a height of roughly 10 meters. The limestone removed from this trench, thousands of tons of it, was not discarded. It was used to build the Sphinx Temple, which stands directly in front of the monument, and portions of the adjacent valley temple of Khafre. The Sphinx and the temples are made of the same stone. They are, in geological terms, the same structure, one carved down, the other built up, from the same ridge of Eocene limestone. This geological relationship is the strongest evidence for associating the Sphinx with Khafre's building program. But geological relationships are not inscriptions. They tell us that the Sphinx was carved at roughly the same time as the temples were built. They do not tell us who gave the order. They do not tell us what the monument meant. They do not tell us why, of all the forms the builders could have chosen, a falcon, a cobra, a seated king, a standing god, They chose to carve a recumbent lion with a human face, a creature that had no precedent in Egyptian art at this scale. A creature that, once carved, would never be replicated. The Great Sphinx is unique. There is no other monument like it, anywhere in Egypt, anywhere in the ancient world, anywhere on Earth. It is not the largest sphinx. That distinction belongs to an unfinished sphinx at an alabaster quarry. But it is the oldest, the most famous, and the most mysterious. And the mystery begins with the simplest question. Who? To understand the Sphinx, you must first understand the plateau on which it sits. The Giza Plateau is a tilted shelf of limestone that rises from the Nile floodplain on the east and slopes gently upward toward the west. The three great pyramids sit on the highest ground, Khufu's to the northeast, Khafre's in the center, Menkaura's to the southwest. The Sphinx sits lower, on the eastern edge of the plateau, where the limestone slopes down toward the valley floor. This position is not incidental. It is geological. The Sphinx was carved from a natural outcrop of bedrock that jutted out from the edge of the escarpment, a knob of limestone that the quarrymen working on Khafre's pyramid complex would have encountered as they extracted blocks for the temples below. Mark Lehner, the American archaeologist who has spent more than 4 decades studying the Giza Plateau, and who is by any measure the most thorough modern investigator of the Sphinx, has described the monument's origin in terms that strip away the mysticism and replace it with geology. The Sphinx, Lehner argues, was not built, it was revealed. The quarrymen were already removing stone from the plateau's eastern face to build the valley temple and the causeway of Khafre's pyramid complex. As they cut deeper into the bedrock, they exposed a prominent limestone knob, a geological feature, a bump in the rock that was too large and too oddly shaped to be simply removed. Someone made a decision. Instead of quarrying the knob away, they would carve it, they would shape it, they would turn an obstacle into a monument. This explanation, the Sphinx as an opportunistic sculpture, carved from a geological accident, is elegant and widely accepted among mainstream Egyptologists, but it raises its own questions. If the Sphinx was simply the result of an encounter between quarrymen and a rock outcrop, why was it given such an extraordinary form? Why not carve a seated king or a standing figure or one of the conventional royal statues that decorated every other pyramid complex? Why a lion? Why a lion with a human head? And why on this particular scale, a scale so vast that no subsequent pharaoh across 3,000 years of Egyptian history ever attempted to match it? The physical monument offers some clues. The Sphinx is carved from 3 distinct layers of limestone, each with different properties. The head and upper neck are carved from the hardest layer, dense, grey, fine-grained limestone known as Member 3, which forms the upper stratum of the Giza Formation. This is the same hard limestone that forms the capstone of the plateau and the upper portions of the nearby rock-cut tombs. It is durable, resistant to erosion, and capable of holding fine detail. This is why the Sphinx's face, despite 4.5 millennia of exposure, retains recognizable features. The cheekbones, the brow ridge, the outlines of the Neme's headdress are still visible, still sharp, still human. The body, however, is carved from a softer, more variable rock, Member 2, a sequence of alternating hard and soft limestone layers that erode at dramatically different rates. The hard layers protrude like ribs. The soft layers recede between them, creating the undulating, wave-like profile that gives the Sphinx's body its distinctive weathered appearance. This differential erosion has been at the center of the most contentious geological debate in the history of Egyptology, a debate that at its most extreme has questioned whether the Sphinx is centuries or millennia older than the pyramids beside it, but we will come to that. The lowest portions of the Sphinx, the pores, the base, the floor of the enclosure, are cut into the weakest rock of all. Member 1, a soft, porous limestone that absorbs water like a sponge and crumbles at a touch. This layer has required extensive restoration. The original rock surface of the pores has been entirely obscured by centuries of repair work. Mud brick repairs from the New Kingdom, limestone block repairs from the Roman period, cement repairs from the 20th century. The Sphinx, from the pores down, is a patchwork, original rock overlaid with 3,000 years of human intervention. The monument's orientation is also significant. The Sphinx faces due east, toward the rising sun. In Egyptian cosmology, the east was the direction of rebirth. The sun was born each morning from the eastern horizon, traversed the sky during the day, died each evening in the west, and was reborn again at dawn. The Sphinx, facing east, was aligned with this cycle, and its identification in the New Kingdom as Horomakhet, Horus of the horizon, suggests that the Egyptians of later periods understood the monument as a solar symbol, a guardian of the eastern horizon, a divine sentinel watching for the return of the sun. But was this the original intention? Or was the solar symbolism a later reinterpretation, a New Kingdom gloss applied to a monument whose original meaning had already been forgotten? This question goes to the heart of the Sphinx problem. The New Kingdom Egyptians, the ones who gave the monument the name Horomakhet, who erected the dream stele between its paws, who built temples in its shadow, lived more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved. They did not know who built it. They did not know why. They knew only that it was ancient, that it was powerful, and that it faced the rising sun. Everything else was interpretation. The dream stele is the most famous of these interpretations. It is a slab of pink granite, roughly 3.5 meters high and just over 2 meters wide, erected between the front paws of the Sphinx by Pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1401 BC. The stele tells a story. The young prince Thutmose, not yet pharaoh, was hunting near the pyramids. He rested in the shadow of the Sphinx, which by that time was buried in sand up to its neck, and fell asleep. In his sleep, the Sphinx spoke to him. It identified itself as Horomakhet Khepri Ra Atum, a composite sun god, and made a promise: "Clear the sand from my body, and I will make you king." Thutmose did as he was told. He cleared the sand. He became king, and he erected the stele to commemorate the bargain. The story is almost certainly propaganda. Some scholars believe Thutmose may have usurped the throne from an older brother, and the dream stele was a convenient way to claim divine sanction for an irregular succession. 3 other stelae, now lost, once depicted other sons of Thutmose's father, Amenhotep II, making offerings to the Sphinx, and the names of those princes were carefully erased. The erasure suggests that Thutmose wanted to eliminate evidence that other princes had also sought the Sphinx's favour. The dream stele was not just a religious monument, it was a political document. But the stele also contains a tantalizing fragment that has fueled one of the longest-running debates in Egyptology. On the 13th line of the inscription, the line that runs across the crack that has destroyed roughly half the text, the syllable haf appears. This syllable is the beginning of the name Khafre. If the full name was originally present on the stele, it would link the Sphinx to Khafre 1,000 years after the monument was built. Not as the builder, necessarily, but as someone associated with it. The Egyptologist Thomas Young, in the 1820s, read the damaged line as stating that Khafre had commissioned the Sphinx. But other scholars have argued that the syllable Khaf could be part of a different word, or that the line may simply refer to Khafre's pyramid complex in a geographical sense, identifying the location of the Sphinx rather than its builder. The dream stele, in other words, almost tells us who built the Sphinx, almost. But the crack in the stone, the physical damage that destroyed the critical line, has left the most important word incomplete. And incomplete evidence, in archaeology, is worse than no evidence at all. It invites speculation. It allows every interpreter to read the gap differently. And for more than 2 centuries, that is exactly what has happened. The modern excavation history of the Sphinx begins with Giovanni Battista Caviglia, a Genoese sea captain who became obsessed with the monuments of Giza. In 1817, Caviglia assembled a team of 160 men and began digging the Sphinx free from the sand that had buried it up to its shoulders. He succeeded in exposing the chest and the front paws, and between the paws he found fragments of the Sphinx's ceremonial beard and the red paint that had once covered its face. He also found the dream stele, still its original position, still legible, still telling its story of a young prince and a sleeping god. But Caviglia could not complete the excavation. The sand returned as fast as his men could remove it. The Sphinx was like a patient half-emerged from anesthesia, briefly visible, then swallowed again by the desert. It would take another century before the monument was fully exposed. Auguste Mariette cleared more sand in 1853. Gaston Maspero continued the work in the 1880s. But it was not until the 1920s that the French engineer Émile Barrès undertook the comprehensive excavation that finally revealed the Sphinx in its entirety: pores, body, enclosure, and the full U-shaped trench from which it had been carved. Barrès also began the first modern restoration, repairing cracks in the head with cement and reinforcing the deteriorating body with new limestone blocks. Selim Hassan, the Egyptian archaeologist who worked alongside Barrès and who continued excavating the Giza plateau into the 1940s, wrote the words that still capture the scholarly consensus and its limits more accurately than any statement before or since. Taking all things into consideration, Hassan wrote, "It seems that we must give the credit of erecting this, the world's most wonderful statue, to Khafre, but always with this reservation, that there is not one single contemporary inscription which connects the Sphinx with Khafre, so sound as it may appear. We must treat the evidence as circumstantial until such time as a lucky turn of the spade of the excavator will reveal to the world a definite reference to the erection of the Sphinx. That lucky turn of the spade has never come." Hassan wrote those words in the 1940s. 8 decades later, the definitive inscription remains unfound, the evidence remains circumstantial, and the Sphinx remains, in the strictest archaeological sense, anonymous. But anonymity has not deterred investigation. In fact, the absence of a definitive answer has generated one of the richest and most contentious scholarly debates in the history of archaeology. The Sphinx has been studied by archaeologists, geologists, astronomers, engineers, forensic artists, and even police detectives, each bringing their own discipline's tools to bear on a problem that defies easy resolution. Lena, whose doctoral dissertation at Yale in 1901 was the first comprehensive archaeological study of the Sphinx in modern times, approached the monument as a geologist as well as an archaeologist. He mapped every stone, every layer, every crack. He correlated the geological strata of the Sphinx's body with the strata exposed in the walls of the enclosure and in the nearby quarries. He traced the limestone blocks used in the Sphinx temple back to the specific layers from which they had been cut, demonstrating, conclusively, that the temple was built with stone removed during the carving of the Sphinx. The two structures were part of a single construction program. They were built at the same time by the same workforce as part of the same architectural plan. And that plan, Lena argues, was Khafre's. The Sphinx temple sits directly in front of the Sphinx, aligned with its gaze. The Valley Temple of Khafre sits immediately to the south of the Sphinx temple, connected to it by a shared wall. The causeway of Khafre's pyramid complex passes within meters of the Sphinx enclosure. The entire eastern face of the Giza plateau, Sphinx, Sphinx temple, Valley temple, causeway, forms a unified composition designed to guide the visitor from the valley floor, past the divine guardian, through the temples, and up the causeway to the king's pyramid on the hilltop above. The Sphinx is the centerpiece of this composition, and the composition is Khafre's. The architectural argument is powerful, but it is not the only evidence. In 1853, when Mariette was clearing sand from around the Sphinx, he discovered a jarite statue of Khafre in the ruins of the Valley Temple. The statue, now one of the most famous works of art from the Old Kingdom, on display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, shows the king seated on a throne, protected by the falcon god Horus, whose wings wrap around the back of Khafre's head. The statue's face is idealized but recognizable. Strong jaw, prominent cheekbones, calm expression, and many observers have noted a resemblance between this face and the face of the Sphinx. But resemblance is not proof. The Sphinx's face has been eroded, repaired, and possibly carved over 4.5 millennia. The proportions have changed. The nose is missing, deliberately destroyed, most likely by a Sufi Muslim cleric named Mohammed Saim al-Dar in the 14th century, according to the 15th century Arab historian al-Makrizi. The popular myth that Napoleon's troops shot off the nose is false. Drawings made by the Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden in 1737, more than 60 years before Napoleon's arrival, already show the nose missing. Without the nose, without the original painted surface, Without the beard that once projected from the chin, the Sphinx's face is a shadow of its original appearance. Comparing it to a pristine diorite portrait is an exercise in inference, not identification, and there is a further complication. In 2004, the French Egyptologist Vasile Dobrev proposed that the Sphinx was not built by Khafre at all, but by his older brother Djedefre, who briefly held the throne between Khufu and Khafre. Dobrev argued that the Sphinx's face more closely resembles portraits of Khufu than of Khafre, and that Djedefre commissioned the monument as a tribute to his father. In this reading, the Sphinx is not Khafre's guardian. It is Khufu's memorial, a colossal portrait of the builder of the Great Pyramid, carved by a son who wanted to honor his father's legacy. The German Egyptologist Rainer Stadelmann offered a related argument that the Sphinx was built by Khufu himself as part of the original Great Pyramid complex, and that Khafre's temples were later oriented to take advantage of the pre-existing monument. 3 candidates: Khufu, Khafre, Djedefre. 3 theories, 3 sets of evidence, and no contemporary inscription to resolve the matter. The Sphinx is the most studied monument in the world, and it still will not say its maker's name. And beyond the question of the builder lies the deeper mystery, the question of purpose. Why a Sphinx? Why a lion with a human head? What theological, cosmological, or political function did this unprecedented monument serve? And why, if it was so important, was it allowed to be buried in sand within centuries of its construction, forgotten, neglected, swallowed by the desert, until a young prince fell asleep in its shadow and heard it speak? These questions are not academic. They go to the heart of how we understand the most intense period of monumental building in human history. The 4th dynasty built the 3 Great Pyramids, the Queen's Pyramids, the mastabas of the eastern and western cemeteries, the valley temples, the causeways, and the Sphinx, all within a span of roughly 120 years. The Sphinx is not a footnote to that program. It is a component, perhaps the most symbolically important component, and its meaning, its builder, and its purpose are the missing pieces of a puzzle that defines the Old Kingdom itself. To understand the scale of that puzzle, consider the Sphinx's physical presence on the plateau more carefully. The monument is not simply a statue placed on flat ground. It is carved into a depression, the Sphinx enclosure, a man-made trench cut into the bedrock, roughly 57 meters long and roughly 9 meters deep at its deepest point. The enclosure walls, the vertical faces of rock left standing when the trench was cut, are themselves important archaeological features. They expose the geological layers of the Giza Formation in cross-section, providing a stratigraphic record that geologists can read like a book. And it is the reading of those walls that has produced the most controversial theory about the Sphinx in modern history. But before we come to that controversy, consider one more aspect of the Sphinx's physical form. The head is disproportionately small relative to the body. This is visible to any observer. The body is massive, leonine, built to the proportions of a recumbent lion, while the head is human-scaled, sitting atop the neck like a marble on a table. Various explanations have been proposed. Lena suggested that the original natural outcrop had a smaller knob of hard limestone at one end, the knob that became the head, and a larger mass of softer stone below, the mass that became the body. The head was constrained by the geology, the body was not. The disproportion in this reading is geological, not artistic. Others have proposed a more dramatic explanation, that the head was originally larger, perhaps a lion's head, matching the body, and was later recarved into a human head during the 4th dynasty or even later. This theory, championed by several researchers outside mainstream Egyptology, argues that the current human head is a secondary feature, sculpted over an earlier, larger animal head. The smaller size of the human head in this reading is the inevitable result of recarving. You cannot add stone to a sculpture, you can only remove it. If the original head was a lion's head, and the lion's head was later reshaped into a human face, the human face would necessarily be smaller than the lion's head it replaced. This theory is attractive but unproven. No tool marks consistent with recarving have been identified on the Sphinx's head. The geological analysis of the head's stone, member 3, the hardest layer, is consistent with original carving, not secondary reworking. And the proportions of the Neme's headdress, while awkward, are not inconsistent with 4th Dynasty artistic conventions, which sometimes depicted the royal headdress at a smaller scale than a modern sculptor might choose. The recarving theory remains speculative, but it persists because the proportions really are odd and because the oddness demands explanation. The Sphinx, then, is a monument defined by absence. The absence of an inscription, the absence of a name, the absence of a known purpose, the absence of a proportionate head, the absence of a nose, the absence of paint, the absence of the original surface which has been replaced by centuries of repair. What remains is a rough limestone core, the ghost of a monument, the skeleton of a sculpture, the rock beneath the art. And yet that ghost has fascinated humanity for 5,000 years. The Sphinx does not need its nose to hold our attention. It does not need its paint to inspire awe. It does not need its name to be the most famous statue on Earth. The absence is the attraction. The mystery is the monument. And the monument, for all its physical decay, is more powerful now, more fascinating, more debated, more studied, than it was when its paint was fresh, and its features were sharp, and its builder's name was presumably common knowledge. Time has stripped the Sphinx of its identity, and in doing so, time has made the Sphinx immortal, not as a portrait of a king, not as a theological symbol, not as an architectural component, but as a question. The oldest, largest, most visible question in the world. Who built this and why? The archaeological approach to answering that question has evolved dramatically over the past century. Cavalier dug for treasure. Mariette dug for statues. Barries dug for the monument itself. But Lina, beginning in the 1970s and continuing through the 2000s, dug for context. His approach was not to excavate the Sphinx in isolation, but to understand it as part of a living landscape, a landscape of quarries, temples, settlements, and infrastructure that together formed the largest construction site in the ancient world. Lina's Giza Plateau Mapping Project, launched in collaboration with Zahi Hawass and the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, used satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic surface survey to create the most detailed map of the Giza Plateau ever produced. The project identified the workers' village that housed the laborers who built the pyramids, a settlement of barracks, bakeries, breweries, and administrative buildings located southeast of the Sphinx, dating to the reigns of Khufu and Khafre. The project traced the quarry faces from which the pyramid stones were cut. It mapped the causeways, the harbours, and the delivery ramps, and it placed the Sphinx, for the first time, within the full operational framework of the 4th Dynasty building program. The result was a picture, not of a single monument, but of a system, a machine for building eternity, operating at industrial scale, powered by the labour of thousands, directed by the authority of the state. The Sphinx was not an isolated act of artistic inspiration. It was a component of that machine, a product of the same quarrying operation that produced the temples, carved by the same workforce that built the pyramids, serving a purpose, whatever that purpose was, that fitted within the theological program of the 4th Dynasty royal burial complex. But the purpose remains the riddle, and the riddle has generated answers that range from the orthodox to the extraordinary. The core problem of the Sphinx is not architectural, it is epistemological. We do not know who built it because the evidence that would tell us, a dated inscription, a royal decree, a construction record, either never existed or has not survived. What we have instead is circumstantial evidence. The Sphinx's physical relationship to Khafre's pyramid complex, the geological connection between the Sphinx enclosure and the Sphinx temple, the stylistic similarities between the Sphinx's face and the known portraits of 4th Dynasty kings, and the damaged syllable on the dream stele that might or might not spell the name Khafre. This circumstantial evidence is strong. It has convinced the majority of Egyptologists that Khafre is the most likely builder, but circumstantial evidence, by definition, admits alternatives. And the alternatives have been pursued with vigour. Begin with the geological evidence. The evidence that connects the Sphinx to Khafre's building program through the shared stone of the Sphinx temple. Lina's work demonstrated that the large limestone blocks used in the Sphinx temple were quarried from the enclosure surrounding the Sphinx's body. The blocks retain the same geological layering as the enclosure walls. the same alternation of hard and soft strata that gives the Sphinx's body its ribbed appearance. This means the Sphinx and the Sphinx temple are contemporary. You cannot build the temple without first carving the Sphinx, because the blocks come from the trench that creates the Sphinx's body. The carving and the building are simultaneous. But the Sphinx temple is not the only structure built with this stone. Some of the blocks from the Sphinx enclosure were used in the Valley Temple of Khafre as well, a building that is unambiguously part of Khafre's complex, connected to his pyramid by a causeway. If the Sphinx stones went into Khafre's Valley Temple, then the quarrying of the Sphinx enclosure was part of Khafre's construction program. And if the quarrying was part of Khafre's program, then the carving of the Sphinx was too. The logic is simple. The stones cannot lie, or can they? The Stadelman theory complicates this picture. If the Sphinx was carved by Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid 1 generation before Khafre, then the Sphinx would have existed before Khafre's Valley Temple was built. Khafre's builders, arriving on the plateau a generation later, would have found the Sphinx already there and simply incorporated the existing quarry stone into their own temple construction. In this scenario, the geological connection between the Sphinx and Khafre's temple does not prove that Khafre built the Sphinx. It proves only that Khafre's builders used stone from an existing quarry, a quarry that happened to surround a monument carved by Khafre's father. This is a plausible alternative. It is also unprovable. The geological evidence tells us that the Sphinx and the temples share the same stone. It does not tell us who carved the stone first. Without an inscription, without a date, the sequence of events is reconstructed from logic, not from evidence. And logic, in archaeology, is a slippery tool. The architectural argument is equally contested. The alignment of the Sphinx with Khafre's causeway and Valley Temple is the strongest spatial evidence for the Khafre attribution. But alignments can be coincidental, or, more precisely, they can be the result of later builders designing their complexes to incorporate an existing monument. If the Sphinx was already on the plateau when Khafre began his pyramid complex, Khafre's architects would naturally have oriented the causeway and Valley Temple to relate to it. The alignment would then be evidence, not that Khafre built the Sphinx, but that Khafre's builders responded to its presence. Lena himself has acknowledged this possibility, while ultimately rejecting it. His stratigraphic analysis of the Sphinx enclosure and the surrounding structures showed that the northern perimeter wall of the Khafre Valley Temple had to be partially deconstructed to allow the construction of the Sphinx Temple, suggesting that the Valley Temple came first and the Sphinx Temple was built afterward. This sequence implies that the Sphinx was carved after Khafre's Valley Temple was already under construction, which would place the Sphinx firmly within Khafre's building program. But other scholars read the stratigraphic evidence differently. The construction sequences at Giza are extraordinarily complex, multiple phases of building, modification, and repair, all conducted over decades. The relationship between the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple may reflect not a simple before and after sequence, but an overlapping, iterative process in which both structures were modified simultaneously. The stratigraphic evidence, like the geological evidence, is suggestive but not conclusive, and it gets worse. The most dramatic challenge to the conventional dating of the Sphinx came not from an archaeologist or an Egyptologist, but from a geologist. In 1991, Robert Schoch, an associate professor of natural sciences at Boston University, presented a paper at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America, in which he argued that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx's body and enclosure walls were inconsistent with the conventional date of approximately 2500 BC. Schoch claimed that the deep, vertical, rounded erosion he observed on the enclosure walls was characteristic of rainfall erosion, the kind of weathering produced by sustained, heavy precipitation running down vertical rock faces over long periods. This type of erosion, Schoch argued, was fundamentally different from the horizontal, wind-driven erosion visible on other Old Kingdom structures at Giza. And since the Giza Plateau had not received significant rainfall since roughly 5000 BC, the end of the last major wet period in North Africa, the Sphinx must have been carved before that date. Schoch proposed a construction date of between 7000 and 5000 BC, millennia before the Fourth Dynasty, millennia before the pyramids, millennia before the conventional beginning of Egyptian civilization. The reaction from mainstream Egyptology was immediate and intense. Lina, Hawass, and virtually every professional Egyptologist rejected Schoch's conclusions. Their objections were multiple. First, the erosion on the Sphinx's body can be explained by other mechanisms: the differential weathering of hard and soft limestone layers, the capillary action of groundwater carrying dissolved salts to the surface, and the occasional torrential rainstorms that do occur in the Eastern Sahara, even under arid conditions. The soft member 2 limestone from which the Sphinx's body is carved is notoriously susceptible to erosion from all these causes. Second, there is no archaeological evidence for a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx before the 4th millennium BC. The pre-dynastic cultures of the Nile Valley were sophisticated. They practiced agriculture, produced pottery, and built villages, but they did not produce monumental stone sculpture. The idea that a pre-dynastic society carved the Sphinx implies a level of social organization and artistic ambition for which there is no corroborating evidence. Third, and most damaging to Schoch's theory, the geological strata from which the Sphinx was carved are the same strata exposed in the quarries used for Khafre's pyramid complex. If the Sphinx had been carved thousands of years before the pyramids, the quarry faces surrounding it would show dramatically different erosion patterns. The Sphinx enclosure walls would be far more eroded than the nearby quarry faces, which were only exposed during the 4th dynasty. Lina argued that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls are consistent with the erosion patterns on the 4th dynasty quarry faces, suggesting that both were exposed at roughly the same time. The debate between Schoch and the mainstream has continued for more than 3 decades. Schoch has maintained his position, refining his arguments and responding to criticisms. The mainstream has maintained its position, pointing to the overwhelming archaeological context that places the Sphinx in the 4th dynasty. Neither side has conceded, and the debate, while technically geological, has become a proxy for a larger argument, an argument about the nature of evidence, the limits of disciplinary expertise, and the question of who has the authority to interpret the past. But here's the problem with framing the Sphinx debate as a simple two-sided argument. The real mystery is not whether the Sphinx was built by Khafre or by a pre-dynastic civilization. The real mystery is more specific, more frustrating, and more archaeologically significant. Why is there no inscription? The 4th dynasty Egyptians were not illiterate. They produced written records. They inscribed the names of kings and queens in their tombs, on their temple walls, on their statuary. They labelled their construction blocks with the names of work gangs. They recorded the provenance of their building materials. The Great Pyramid itself contains quarry marks, painted inscriptions on the interior blocks that identify the work gangs responsible for cutting and transporting them. One of these inscriptions, discovered in 1837 by Howard Weiss, reads "Friends of Khufu," providing one of the few direct textual links between the Great Pyramid and its builder. No equivalent inscription has ever been found on the Sphinx. No quarry marks, no work gang names, no dedication text, nothing. The monument that should be the most thoroughly documented, the largest single sculpture in the ancient world, carved from a ridge of bedrock on the most active construction site in Egypt, is the least documented. The pyramids have inscriptions. The mastabas have inscriptions. The temples have inscriptions. The Sphinx has nothing. Something is wrong with our assumptions. Either the Sphinx did originally have inscriptions that have been destroyed by erosion and repair, which is possible given the severe deterioration of the body's surface, or the Sphinx was deliberately left uninscribed, which would be extraordinary for a royal monument of this scale. In the first scenario, the evidence once existed and is now lost. In the second scenario, the evidence was never created, which would imply that the Sphinx served a function so self-evident to its builders that no explanation was needed. A guardian, a sentinel, a divine image so powerful that it required no name. Either way, the silence of the Sphinx is not an accident. It is a condition, a fundamental feature of the monument, as much a part of its identity as the lion's body or the royal headdress. The Sphinx was built to be seen, not to be read. It communicates through presence, not through text. And in a civilization that inscribed its name on virtually everything it built, this silence is deafening. And then there is the question of the face. Whose face is it? If the Sphinx was built by Khafre, then the face should be Khafre's. If it was built by Khufu or Djedefre, the face should be Khufu's. And if it was built by a pre-dynastic civilization, the face belongs to no known person at all. The face of the Sphinx has been the subject of forensic analysis on several occasions. In 1993, the New York Police Department detective Frank Domingo, a forensic artist specializing in facial identification, was invited to compare the Sphinx's face with the known portraits of Khafre. Domingo used the same techniques he applied to criminal identification, measuring the proportions of the face, the angles of the jaw, the distance between features. His conclusion was definitive. The Sphinx's face did not match Khafre's. The jaw angle was different, the brow was different, the proportions were different. Domingo reported that the two faces belonged to different individuals. This finding was widely reported but has not been accepted by most Egyptologists, who point out that the Sphinx's face has been severely eroded and possibly recarved, making forensic comparison unreliable. The idealized nature of Egyptian royal portraiture also complicates the analysis. Fourth Dynasty sculptures were not meant to be photographic likenesses, but stylized representations of divine kingship. Two portraits of the same king, carved by different artists in different materials, might look quite different from each other while still representing the same person. Hawass, who has been the most vocal defender of the Khafre attribution, has argued that the Sphinx's face, despite its erosion, retains the essential features of the Khafre portrait: the broad cheekbones, the strong jaw, the regal bearing. Dobrev, by contrast, has argued that the face more closely resembles the few surviving portraits of Khufu, a small ivory figurine, only 7.5 centimeters tall, found at Abydos, which is the only confirmed three-dimensional likeness of the builder of the Great Pyramid. Comparing the face of the Sphinx to a 7-centimeter figurine is, to put it mildly, a challenging exercise. But the comparison has been made, and the debate continues. The face, like the inscription, refuses to give a definitive answer. It is a human face. It is a royal face. It wears the Nemes headdress. It had a ceremonial beard. It had a uraeus, the rearing cobra, symbol of royal authority, on its forehead. All of these features identify the Sphinx as a pharaoh. But which pharaoh remains? After 4.5 millennia of erosion and debate, an open question. And it gets stranger still when you consider what the Sphinx meant to the Egyptians who came after the Fourth Dynasty. Because the Sphinx was not simply forgotten, it was transformed. Within centuries of its construction, the monument had become something its builders almost certainly did not intend: a deity, a god in its own right, an object of worship, independent of whatever pharaoh's face it carried. The New Kingdom Egyptians, the Egyptians of the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, roughly 1400 to 1100 BC, encountered the Sphinx as an ancient monument buried in sand. By their time, the Fourth Dynasty was 1,000 years in the past, as distant from them as the early medieval period is from us. The pyramids were ancient, the mastabas were ruins. The names of the Fourth Dynasty queens were already fading from memory, and the Sphinx, half buried, noseless, its paint long gone, had acquired a numinous quality that transcended its original identity. It was no longer a portrait of a king, it was a god, Horemheb, Horus of the horizon, the divine sentinel of the eastern sky. The worship of the Sphinx as Horemheb was not a marginal cult, it was a major royal practice. Amenhotep II, father of Thutmose IV, built a temple to Horemheb near the Sphinx. Ramesses II erected stelae in the Sphinx's honor. Princes and nobles left offerings and inscriptions between its paws. The Sphinx had become a pilgrimage site, one of the holiest places in Egypt, visited by kings and commoners alike. And the worship continued for centuries. Through the New Kingdom, through the Third Intermediate Period, through the Late Period, through the Ptolemaic era, and into the Roman period, The Sphinx was venerated. Roman-era visitors left graffiti on its paws. Small votary sphinxes were sold to pilgrims. The monument that the Fourth Dynasty had built, for whatever purpose, had become something entirely different, a living god, buried in sand, speaking to anyone who slept in its shadow. This transformation, from royal monument to independent deity, is the key to understanding why the Sphinx's original identity was lost. The New Kingdom Egyptians did not want to know who built the Sphinx. They wanted to know what the Sphinx wanted. The dream stele is not a historical document. It is a religious text, a record of divine communication, not of architectural patronage. Thutmose IV did not ask the Sphinx who built it. He asked the Sphinx to make him king. The builder's identity was, for Thutmose, irrelevant. What mattered was the god's power. What mattered was the favor. And this is perhaps the deepest irony of the Sphinx's story. The monument that we now struggle to attribute to a specific king was, for most of its history, valued precisely because it had transcended its human origins. The Sphinx was not a king. The Sphinx was a god, and gods do not have builders. Gods simply are. But here's what makes this truly terrifying from an archaeological perspective. The transformation of the Sphinx from portrait to deity may have involved physical alteration. If the Sphinx's face was originally carved in the likeness of Khufu or Khafre, was it later recarved, subtly, by New Kingdom sculptors, to remove identifying features and replace them with the more generic, more divine countenance of Horemakhet? This would explain the proportional oddity of the head. This would explain the difficulty of matching the face to any specific Fourth Dynasty king. This would explain why the face seems both royal and anonymous, human but unidentifiable. The face we see today may not be the face that was carved in the 25th century BC. It may be a face that was modified 1,000 years later, adapted to serve a new theology, scraped smooth of its original identity. This theory, the secondary recarving theory, is speculative. There is no direct evidence for it, but there is also no evidence against it. The surface of the Sphinx's head is weathered and worn. Multiple layers of repair are visible. The possibility that the face was modified cannot be excluded. And if it was modified, then the forensic debate about whose face the Sphinx carries is based on a false premise, because the face we are comparing to Fourth Dynasty portraits may not be a Fourth Dynasty face at all. The Sphinx, then, is not one mystery. It is a stack of mysteries, each one nested inside the last, each one more difficult to resolve. Who built it? We are not certain. Whose face does it carry? We cannot identify it definitively. What was its original purpose? We can only guess. Was it modified after its construction? We cannot rule it out. And what did it mean to the people who carved it? We will probably never know, because those people left no text, no inscription, no record of the most extraordinary sculpture they ever produced. The silence is the monument. The mystery is the meaning. And the Sphinx, crouched on the bedrock of the Giza plateau, facing east into a sunrise it has watched 4,500 times 365, gives nothing away. But the physical evidence, when examined closely, does yield some partial answers. Answers that, while not resolving the central question, narrow the field of possibilities and eliminate some of the more extreme theories. Consider the workers' village, Lena's excavation of the settlement south of the Sphinx, a complex of barracks, bakeries, and administrative buildings known as the workers' village, demonstrated that the Giza Plateau supported a large, organized workforce during the reigns of Khufu and Khafre. The bakeries alone were capable of producing bread for thousands of workers daily. The barracks could house a permanent workforce of several thousand, with temporary accommodation for many more during peak construction periods. This infrastructure, the logistics of feeding, housing, and managing a construction workforce on an industrial scale, existed during Khafre's reign. No comparable infrastructure has been found from any earlier period. If the Sphinx was carved before the Fourth Dynasty, it was carved without the logistical support that every other major construction project at Giza required. This absence of earlier infrastructure is a powerful argument against the pre-dynastic dating proposed by Schock and others. Carving a Sphinx was not a minor undertaking. The monument required the removal of thousands of tons of bedrock. The removed stone had to be transported and shaped into building blocks. the enclosure walls had to be cut to precise dimensions. The body had to be sculpted with detail sufficient to represent a recognizable form. All of this demanded organized labor, skilled supervision, and sustained provisioning over months or years. The Fourth Dynasty had the resources, the organization, and the logistical capacity to accomplish this. There is no evidence that any earlier culture at Giza did. The paint traces found on the Sphinx are another clue. Khafre, in 1817, found fragments of red paint on the face of the Sphinx. Later investigators found traces of blue and yellow paint on the Neme's headdress and the remnants of a ceremonial beard. The Sphinx, in its original state, was not the bare limestone monument we see today. It was painted, vibrantly, dramatically, in the same red, blue, and yellow palette used on other Fourth Dynasty monuments. This paint is consistent with Old Kingdom artistic conventions. It is not consistent with pre-dynastic art, which used different pigments and different application techniques. The paint supports a Fourth Dynasty date. The ceremonial beard is also significant. Fragments of the Sphinx's beard were found by Khafre between the pores and later by subsequent excavators. Some fragments are now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, others are in the British Museum in London. The beard is a braided divine-type beard, the kind worn by gods, not by living kings. This has led some scholars to suggest that the beard was a later addition, added during the New Kingdom when the Sphinx was reimagined as the god Horemheb. But others argue that the beard was original, and that the Sphinx was always intended to represent a divine being, a god-king, a pharaoh in his divine aspect, a fusion of human royalty and leonine divinity. The beard debate mirrors the larger debate about the Sphinx itself. Was the monument a portrait of a living king or a representation of a god? Was it built to honor a specific pharaoh or to embody a cosmic principle? The answer depends on how you interpret the evidence, and the evidence, once again, is ambiguous. Let that sink in. The most famous monument in the world, the one that stares back at you from every photograph of Egypt, the one that appears on currency, on stamps, on the covers of 1,000 books, cannot be securely attributed to any individual. Its builder is uncertain, its name is unknown, its purpose is debated, its face is unidentifiable, and the one inscription that might resolve the matter, the dream stele, with its tantalizing syllable Khaf, is broken precisely where the crucial word should be. The Sphinx is not a monument that has been studied insufficiently. It has been studied exhaustively by archaeologists, geologists, astronomers, engineers, forensic scientists, and art historians. And the conclusion, after more than a century of scientific investigation, is that the circumstantial evidence points to Khafre, but the definitive proof has never been found. The Sphinx remains, in Hassan's words, circumstantially Khafre's, and nothing more. This is not a failure of scholarship, it is a feature of the evidence. Some questions, posed to the right monument at the right distance of time, simply cannot be answered with the tools available. The Sphinx was carved by someone. That someone did not sign their work. And 4,500 years of erosion, robbery, modification, and neglect have ensured that the signature, if it ever existed, is gone. The question now is not whether we can identify the builder with certainty. We almost certainly cannot. The question is what the Sphinx tells us despite its silence. What can we learn from a monument that refuses to speak? What does the absence of a name tell us about the culture that produced it? And what does the survival of the monument, nameless, eroded, incomplete, tell us about the relationship between identity and permanence? These questions lead us to the deepest layer of the Sphinx problem, the layer that connects the individual mystery of the monument to the universal mystery of how civilizations remember and how they forget. The Fourth Dynasty built the most enduring monuments in human history. The Great Pyramid has survived for 45 centuries. The Sphinx has survived for 45 centuries. The limestone blocks, the granite chambers, the carved bedrock. These materials have demonstrated a durability that no modern building material can match. But the names, the inscriptions, the records, the soft tissue of civilization, the fragile information that tells us who and why, these have not survived with the same resilience. The Great Pyramid lost its casing stones but kept its quarry marks. The mastabas lost their grave goods but kept their painted walls. The Sphinx lost everything. Its paint, its beard, its nose, its name, all gone. What remains is form without content, shape without story, a lion's body and a human head staring east, saying nothing. And this is the pattern that the Sphinx embodies more completely than any other monument at Giza. The physical structure outlasts the information it was meant to carry. The stone outlasts the story. The monument outlasts the memory. The fourth dynasty built for eternity. And eternity responded by preserving the buildings while erasing the builders. The pyramid survived. The pharaoh's name survived, barely, through a quarry mark on an interior block. The Sphinx survived, but the Sphinx's builder did not. 4,500 years of desert wind accomplished what no conqueror, no earthquake, no flood could accomplish. It separated the monument from its maker. It turned a portrait into a question. It transformed a royal commission into an enigma. And the transformation continues. Every year, the Sphinx erodes a little more. The soft limestone of its body continues to flake and crumble. The restoration blocks applied in previous centuries continue to crack and separate. The desert wind continues to carry sand against its flanks. The rising water table beneath the Giza plateau continues to draw moisture upward through the bedrock, dissolving the limestone from below. The Sphinx is not static. It is actively decaying, slowly, measurably, continuously. The monument that has survived for 45 centuries is, in geological terms, still dying, and the question of who built it grows a little more distant with each millimetre of stone that falls away. Conservation efforts have slowed the decay but cannot stop it. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has implemented drainage systems to lower the water table. International teams have applied conservation treatments to the most vulnerable surfaces. Access to the Sphinx enclosure has been restricted to reduce foot traffic and vibration, but the scale of the challenge is immense and the forces of deterioration are relentless. The Sphinx was carved from soft, layered, water-sensitive limestone in an environment that, while arid, is not dry enough to prevent capillary action, salt crystallization, and the slow chemical dissolution that has been eating away at the monument since the day it was carved. The Sphinx is losing itself, slowly, continuously, irreversibly, and with each layer of stone that falls, the chances of finding an inscription, a mark, a clue to the builder's identity diminish further. If the answer was ever carved into the Sphinx's surface, if a name was once painted on its flanks or inscribed on its base, it may already be gone. The desert has had 45 centuries to erase it, and the desert, unlike the Sphinx, does not stop working. And there is one further piece of physical evidence that complicates the picture in unexpected ways. The Sphinx is oriented to face due east, but its body is not perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions. The axis of the body deviates slightly from true east-west, a deviation that some researchers have attributed to the irregularity of the natural outcrop from which it was carved. But others have proposed that the deviation is intentional, that the Sphinx was aligned not to the compass but to a celestial event, perhaps the rising point of a particular star, or the position of the sun at a specific date. The astronomical arguments have been pursued most vigorously by researchers outside mainstream Egyptology, notably by Robert Bauval, who argued that the Giza monuments were arranged to mirror the constellation of Orion as it appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC. Bauval's theory, like Schocker's water erosion hypothesis, has been rejected by mainstream scholars, but it has attracted enormous public attention and has contributed to the enduring perception that the Sphinx is older and more mysterious than conventional Egyptology allows. The mainstream response to the astronomical theories is straightforward. The alignment of the Sphinx can be adequately explained by the geology of the site. The natural outcrop from which the Sphinx was carved dictated the orientation of the body. The carvers worked with the rock they had, and the rock did not happen to be aligned perfectly with true east. No celestial calculation was necessary. The Sphinx faces east because the eastern face of the plateau slopes toward the valley, and because east is the direction of the rising sun. The alignment is functional and geological, not astronomical, but the astronomical theories persist because they tap into something deeper than evidence. They tap into the human desire for significance. We want the Sphinx to mean something cosmic. We want its alignment to be intentional, precise, calibrated to the stars. We want it to be more than a geological accident turned into a sculpture. We want it to be a message, a code, a coordinate, a signal from the ancient past. And the Sphinx, in its silence, neither confirms nor denies these desires. It simply faces east, as it has always faced east, and lets us project whatever meaning we choose onto its impassive surface. The projection of meaning onto the Sphinx is itself a subject of study. Every era has seen in the Sphinx what it wanted to see. The ancient Egyptians saw a god, the Greeks saw a riddle, the medieval Arabs saw a talisman, the Renaissance Europeans saw a curiosity. The 19th century archaeologists saw a problem to be solved. The 20th century geologists saw evidence for an older civilization. The 21st century public sees an icon, a symbol so universally recognized that it transcends its archaeological context entirely. The Sphinx has been more things to more people than any other monument in history. And each interpretation tells us more about the interpreter than about the monument. This is perhaps the Sphinx's deepest function, not the one its builders intended, but the one it has actually served for 45 centuries. The Sphinx is a mirror. It reflects the preoccupations of every era that gazes upon it. The Fourth Dynasty saw divine kingship. The New Kingdom saw a solar god. The modern world sees a mystery. Each vision is projected onto the same surface, the same damaged face, the same leonine body, the same Eastern gaze. And each vision is, in its way, correct, because the Sphinx, having lost its original meaning, is available to carry any meaning its observers choose to assign. This is what makes the Sphinx different from the pyramids. The pyramids have a known builder, a known date, a known function. They are archaeologically resolved, imperfectly, with many questions remaining, but fundamentally understood. The Sphinx is archaeologically unresolved, and its unresolved status makes it a screen, a blank surface onto which every culture, every generation, every individual can project their own concerns, their own anxieties, their own desires for connection with the ancient past. The Sphinx does not belong to Khafre. It does not belong to Khufu. It does not belong to any hypothetical pre-dynastic civilization. It belongs to whoever is looking at it at this moment asking, who? Why? What does it mean? The answer changes with the questioner. The question remains the same. And the Sphinx, patient, eroded, silent, waits for the next questioner, the next interpretation, the next era to gaze into its face and see itself reflected. Take each theory in turn. Examine the evidence for each candidate, weigh the arguments, and confront, honestly, the limits of what we can know. The Khafre theory. This is the mainstream position, the view held by the majority of professional Egyptologists, and the one presented in most scholarly publications. The evidence is circumstantial, but cumulative. The Sphinx sits within the architectural footprint of Khafre's pyramid complex. The Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple of Khafre share a perimeter wall. The causeway of Khafre's pyramid passes close to the Sphinx enclosure. The geological strata of the Sphinx's body correspond to the strata exposed in the quarries used for Khafre's construction. The workers' village that supported the Giza construction program dates to the reigns of Khufu and Khafre. The diorite statue of Khafre, found in the Valley Temple by Mariette in 1853, bears a general resemblance to the Sphinx's face. And the damaged syllable Khaf on the dream stele, while inconclusive, is consistent with a reference to Khafre. Hawass has been the most prominent advocate of this position. He has argued, repeatedly and forcefully, that the cumulative weight of the evidence leaves no room for serious doubt. The Sphinx, he has written, represents Khafre as Horus, giving offerings to his father Khufu, embodied in the pyramid, with the power of the sun. In this interpretation, the Sphinx is not simply a portrait of Khafre. It is a theological statement, a representation of the king in his divine aspect, standing guard over his father's pyramid, facing the rising sun, embodying the union of royal power and solar divinity. But the Khafre theory has vulnerabilities. The absence of a contemporary inscription is the most significant. Every other major monument at Giza has been connected to its builder through textual evidence. Quarry marks on the Great Pyramid, inscribed statues in the temples, stellar fragments in the mortuary complexes. The Sphinx alone has no such connection. This absence is not trivial. It is an anomaly that requires explanation. The standard response, that the inscription existed but has been destroyed by erosion, is plausible but unprovable. The alternative, that the Sphinx was deliberately left uninscribed, is intriguing but unprecedented. The Khufu theory, proposed in various forms by Stadelman, Dobrev, and others. This theory argues that the Sphinx was carved during the reign of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, one generation before Khafre. The evidence is thinner than for the Khafre theory, but not negligible. The Sphinx's position on the plateau is closer to the Great Pyramid than to Khafre's pyramid, and the sight line from the Sphinx to the Great Pyramid is unobstructed. Some scholars have argued that the Sphinx's gaze, directed due east, aligns with the rising sun during the autumn equinox, a celestial alignment that they associate with Khufu's solar theology rather than Khafre's. Stadelman argued that the Sphinx was part of Khufu's original architectural program, a monumental guardian intended to protect the eastern approach to the Great Pyramid complex. In this reading, Khafre's builders later incorporated the pre-existing Sphinx into their own complex, building the Valley Temple and causeway to relate to a monument that was already there. The geological evidence, the shared stone between the Sphinx enclosure and Khafre's temples, would then reflect not simultaneous construction but the reuse of existing quarry stone by a later builder. Dobrev's version is subtly different. He proposes that the Sphinx was built not by Khufu, but for Khufu, commissioned by Djedefre, Khufu's eldest son, as a posthumous tribute to his father. Djedefre reigned briefly between Khufu and Khafre and built his own pyramid at Abu Rawash, north of Giza. Dobrev argues that the Sphinx's face resembles the only known portrait of Khufu, the tiny ivory figurine from Abydos, more closely than it resembles the portraits of Khafre. If the Sphinx is a portrait of Khufu, commissioned by Djedefre, then it is a son's memorial to his father, an act of filial piety on a monumental scale. The Khufu-Djedefre theories are minority positions. They have not displaced the Khafre consensus, but they have complicated the picture, introducing plausible alternatives that cannot be easily dismissed. The evidence for Khafre is stronger, but it is not conclusive, and the evidence for Khufu, while weaker, is not negligible. The question remains open: the older Sphinx theory. This is the most controversial position, the one proposed by Schoch and West, rejected by mainstream Egyptology, but persistently popular in the public imagination. The theory rests on the water erosion hypothesis, the claim that the deep, vertical, rounded erosion on the Sphinx's enclosure walls was caused by prolonged rainfall, and that this rainfall occurred thousands of years before the Fourth Dynasty. The geological argument, stripped of its fringe associations, is not unreasonable. The Sphinx enclosure walls do show a distinctive pattern of erosion, deep, vertical channels that cut into the limestone in a way that is visibly different from the horizontal erosion seen on other Old Kingdom structures. Schoch attributes this pattern to precipitation. Mainstream geologists attribute it to other factors: differential weathering of soft and hard limestone layers, salt crystallization from groundwater evaporation, and the occasional heavy rainstorms that occur in the region, even under modern arid conditions. The debate over the erosion patterns has never been fully resolved. Each side has presented geological evidence in support of its position. Each side has responded to the other's criticisms, and each side has accused the other of bias. Schoch accusing mainstream Egyptology of intellectual conservatism, mainstream Egyptology accusing Schoch of ignoring the archaeological context that overwhelmingly favors a Fourth Dynasty date. The most effective rebuttal of Schoch's theory is not geological but archaeological. If the Sphinx was carved before 5000 BC, who carved it? What society, what culture, what labor organization produced a monument of this scale and sophistication at a time when the Nile Valley was populated by village-dwelling farmers who had not yet developed writing, centralized government, or monumental architecture? Schoch has suggested that an unknown, advanced civilization may have existed in the region and was subsequently destroyed or absorbed, but this suggestion has no corroborating evidence. No tools, no settlements, no artifacts, no other monuments from such a civilization have ever been found. The absence of a missing civilization is a significant problem for the older Sphinx theory. Archaeological surveys of the Giza region have been conducted for more than a century. The area has been excavated, surveyed, photographed, and scanned with every available technology. No evidence of a pre-4th dynasty monumental culture has ever emerged. The Sphinx, if it were truly older than the pyramids, would be entirely without parallel, a unique monument produced by a unique civilization that left no other trace. This is not impossible, but it is, by the standards of archaeological reasoning, extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence which has not been produced. The numbers are striking when you lay the candidates side by side. The Khafre theory has the strongest cumulative evidence. Architectural alignment, geological correspondence, workers' infrastructure, stylistic compatibility, and the damaged dream stele syllable. The Khufu theory has a plausible architectural argument and the Dobrev facial comparison, but lacks the geological and spatial specificity of the Khafre evidence. The older Sphinx theory has a genuine geological observation, the distinctive erosion of the enclosure walls, but lacks any archaeological support for a pre-4th dynasty builder. If this were a court of law, the verdict would favour Khafre, not beyond reasonable doubt perhaps, but on the balance of probabilities. If this were a scientific inquiry, the answer would be Khafre, pending further evidence. And if this were a philosophical investigation, the answer would be something more unsettling, that the question itself may be unanswerable, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the evidence, by its nature, cannot provide the certainty we seek. And this brings us to the deepest question, the one that the Sphinx poses not about the 4th dynasty, but about the human relationship with the past. Can we ever truly know who built a monument that left no written record of its construction? Can circumstantial evidence, however strong, substitute for a signed declaration? Can the arrangement of stones, the correspondence of geological strata, the alignment of buildings on a map, ever tell us with certainty what a contemporary inscription could tell us in a single sentence? The answer at Giza is no. The circumstantial evidence tells us that the Sphinx was almost certainly carved during the 4th dynasty, most probably during the reign of Khafre, most likely as part of his pyramid complex. But almost certainly is not certainly, most probably is not definitely. And the Sphinx, staring east with its damaged face and its silent stone, does not confirm or deny. It simply watches. It has been watching for 45 centuries. It will be watching long after the last Egyptologist has closed the last notebook and walked away. And the watching is the point. The Sphinx was not built to answer questions. It was built to ask them. It was built to be what it has always been, the most enduring enigma in the history of human construction. A lion's body and a human head, a king's face and a god's silence, a monument that tells us everything about the ambition of its builders and nothing about their names. But those names are not the only thing the Sphinx has lost. The monument has also lost its body, or rather, the body it once had. The Sphinx we see today is not the Sphinx that was carved in the 4th dynasty. It is a palimpsest, a layered composite of original rock and successive repairs, each layer representing a different era's attempt to hold the monument together. The oldest repairs may date to the New Kingdom. Mud brick walls, now largely gone, were once built against the Sphinx's flanks to shore up the eroding bedrock. Later, during the 26th dynasty, the Saita period, around 600 BC, limestone blocks were fitted against the body in what appears to have been a systematic restoration effort. Roman-era repairs added additional blocks, along with plaster and possibly paint. And in the 20th century, berets applied cement to the head and shoulders, while subsequent Egyptian government restoration programs have added thousands of new limestone blocks to the body, paws and tail. The cumulative result is a monument that is part original and part replacement. A ship of Theseus problem rendered in limestone, the core of the Sphinx, the bedrock from which it was originally carved, is still there. But the surface, in many places, is not original. It is restoration, and the layers of restoration, applied over 3,500 years by builders, with different tools, different materials, and different aesthetic standards, have altered the Sphinx's appearance in ways that are difficult to disentangle from the original form. This is significant for the attribution debate because any argument based on the Sphinx's current appearance, the proportions of the head, the shape of the face, the contours of the body, must account for the fact that the appearance has been modified. The face that Frank Domingo measured and compared to Khafre's portrait may not be the face that was carved in the 25th century BC. The body that Schock examined for erosion patterns may show weathering that postdates the original carving by centuries. The monument is not a frozen snapshot of a single moment. It is an accumulation of moments, a geological and archaeological composite that defies simple interpretation. Mark Lehner understood this better than anyone. His doctoral dissertation mapped every visible stone on the Sphinx's surface, original bedrock and restoration blocks alike, and classified them by type, by period, and by degree of weathering. The resulting map is an extraordinary document, a portrait of the Sphinx's entire material history, from the Eocene limestone deposited tens of millions of years ago to the modern cement applied in the 1920s. The map shows that the original surface of the Sphinx's body has been almost entirely replaced below the neck. The paws are entirely restoration. The lower flanks are restoration. The chest is partially original, partially restored. Only the head, carved from the hardest limestone layer, retains a largely original surface. This means that any analysis of the Sphinx's body, geological, structural, or aesthetic, is analyzing a composite object, not an original one. The erosion patterns that Schock attributed to rainfall are visible on the enclosure walls, which are original bedrock, and on some portions of the Sphinx's body that are also original. But large areas of the body have been covered by restoration blocks, making it difficult to assess the extent and character of the original erosion. The evidence is literally buried beneath the repair, and the repairs themselves are at risk. The limestone blocks applied during the 1980s restoration program were, in some cases, incompatible with the original bedrock, harder, denser, and less porous than the soft member 2 limestone of the Sphinx's body. When hard stone is placed against soft stone, the difference in porosity creates moisture traps, zones where water accumulates, dissolved salts crystallize, and the softer stone crumbles away from within. Some of the 20th century repairs have actually accelerated the deterioration of the original surface they were meant to protect. In 1988, a large block of stone fell from the Sphinx's right shoulder, a dramatic reminder that the monument is not stable. The block's fall prompted a major reassessment of the restoration strategy, leading to more careful material selection and more conservative intervention in subsequent campaigns. But the incident also underscored a fundamental truth. The Sphinx is an active geological system, not a static object. It is subject to the same forces of erosion, gravity, and chemical dissolution that shape the plateau on which it sits. And those forces do not pause for archaeological debate. Now consider the Sphinx in its broader cultural context, not as an isolated monument, but as one element of a theological landscape that stretched across the Giza plateau and beyond. The 4th Dynasty Egyptians did not build individual monuments. They built systems, integrated complexes of pyramids, temples, causeways, and subsidiary structures, each component serving a specific function within a larger program of royal death, rebirth, and divine transformation. In this context, the Sphinx served a function that was not simply decorative. Lehner has proposed that the Sphinx was a component of the solar ritual program that animated Khafre's pyramid complex. The Sphinx faces east. The sun rises in the east. At the autumn and spring equinoxes, the sun rises directly over the Sphinx's shoulder and illuminates the western face of Khafre's pyramid. The alignment is not exact. It varies slightly depending on the equinox and the century, but it is close enough to suggest intentionality. The Sphinx, in this reading, is a solar marker, a monumental indicator of the eastern horizon, positioned to link the rising sun with the king's pyramid. This interpretation is supported by the later identification of the Sphinx as Horemakhet, Horus of the horizon. The horizon, in Egyptian cosmology, was the boundary between the visible world and the invisible realm of the gods. The sun crossed this boundary twice daily, once at dawn, once at dusk. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of Horus, was associated with the sun's daily journey. The Sphinx, facing the eastern horizon, watching the sun rise, embodied this association in monumental form. It was, in Lena's words, a solar icon on a cosmic scale, a three-dimensional representation of the king as the guardian of the horizon, the sentinel, who watches over the boundary between the human world and the divine. If this interpretation is correct, then the Sphinx was not built as a portrait. It was built as a symbol, a theological instrument, designed to participate in the solar rituals that sustained the king's afterlife. The face on the Sphinx is not important because it identifies a specific king. It is important because it identifies the king, any king, every king, as the divine guardian of the horizon. The anonymity of the face, in this reading, is not a loss. It is a feature. The Sphinx was not meant to be a portrait of Khafre. It was meant to be an image of kingship itself. This interpretation is elegant. It explains the absence of an inscription. The Sphinx did not need one because it represented a universal concept, not a specific individual. It explains the proportional oddity of the head. The head was subordinate to the body, because the lion's body, not the human head, was the primary symbol. It explains the solar orientation. The Sphinx faces east because it is a solar icon designed to interact with the rising sun. And it explains the later deification. The New Kingdom Egyptians recognized the Sphinx as Horemakhet because that is what it had always been, even if the name was new. But this interpretation, like every interpretation of the Sphinx, is a theory. It is supported by evidence, but not proven by it. The Sphinx remains, at its core, an act of imagination. The Fourth Dynasty's most ambitious attempt to translate a theological concept into physical form. And the concept, like the builder's name, has been lost to time. What remains is the form, the lion's body, the human head, the eastern gaze, the silence. And the silence speaks louder than any inscription could. Because the Sphinx's silence says something that no carved text could convey, that some monuments are too large for words, that some ideas exceed the capacity of language, that the most profound statement a civilization can make is sometimes not a sentence, but a shape carved from the living rock of the earth, facing the sunrise, waiting, watching, saying nothing. There is one more avenue of investigation that deserves attention, the most recent, the most technologically sophisticated, and the most tantalizing. In 2023, thermal scanning surveys conducted on the Great Pyramid revealed previously unknown internal voids, spaces within the pyramid's structure that had never been accessed in recorded history. These discoveries, made possible by muon tomography and infrared thermography, demonstrated that the Giza monuments still contain secrets that modern technology can reveal. Similar technologies have been applied to the Sphinx, though on a smaller scale. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted around the Sphinx enclosure have identified anomalies in the bedrock beneath and around the monument, cavities, discontinuities, and possible voids that may represent natural geological features or man-made chambers. The interpretation of these anomalies is contested. Some researchers have claimed they indicate the presence of hidden tunnels or chambers beneath the Sphinx, an idea that has captured the popular imagination but has not been confirmed by excavation. The Egyptian authorities have been cautious about granting permission for invasive investigation, and the debate over the subsurface anomalies remains unresolved. Most recently, in 2026, the Khafre research project, led by radar engineer Filippo Biondi, made headlines by claiming that ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery had identified the outline of a possible second Sphinx beneath a sand dune adjacent to the existing monument. The claim is based on an L-shaped anomaly in the radar data and on the observation that the dream stele depicts two sphinxes, not one, a detail that some researchers interpret as evidence that a pair of sphinxes originally guarded the Giza plateau. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has not yet confirmed or denied the claim, and no excavation has been conducted. The possibility of a second sphinx remains for now a hypothesis, intriguing but unproven. But the mere existence of such claims, and the technology that makes them possible, underscores a point that is easy to forget. The investigation of the Sphinx is not over. The sand of Giza has not given up all its secrets. The bedrock beneath the monument has not been fully explored. The enclosure walls have not been exhaustively mapped. The possibility exists, slim perhaps, but real, that new evidence could emerge that resolves the attribution debate once and for all. A buried inscription, a sealed chamber, a foundation deposit containing the builder's name. These are the kinds of discoveries that archaeologists dream of, and that the Sphinx, in its stubborn silence, seems to promise. Hassan's words, written in the 1940s, remain the most apt, until such time as a lucky turn of the spade of the excavator will reveal to the world a definite reference to the erection of the Sphinx. That turn of the spade may come tomorrow. It may come in a century, it may never come. But the possibility keeps the question alive, and the question is what gives the Sphinx its power? A monument whose story is complete, whose builder, date, and purpose are known with certainty, is a monument that can be fully understood, fully categorized, and, in a sense, fully dismissed. It can be placed in a chapter of a textbook, described in a paragraph of a guidebook, and filed in the cabinet of human knowledge. The Sphinx resists this filing. It refuses to be fully understood. It insists on remaining open, a question without an answer, a riddle without a solution, a monument that demands engagement precisely because it will not provide closure. The Sphinx is the only monument at Giza that still actively challenges us. The pyramids have been measured, the mastabas have been catalogued, the temples have been mapped, but the Sphinx has not been explained. And its refusal to be explained is what makes it, after 45 centuries, the most compelling monument on the Giza plateau, more compelling than the Great Pyramid, more compelling than any single tomb or temple, because it still has the power to make us ask, who, why, what were they thinking? What did they see when they looked at this ridge of limestone and imagined a lion with a human face? We do not know, we may never know, and the not knowing is, in its own way, a kind of answer. The Sphinx teaches us that some things endure not because they are understood, but because they are mysterious. Not because they tell us everything, but because they withhold just enough to keep us coming back. And the Sphinx's relationship to the broader Giza landscape reveals another dimension that most accounts overlook. The monument does not sit in isolation. It sits at the center of a complex that includes the Sphinx Temple to its east, the Valley Temple of Khafre to its south, and a series of mud brick walls and drainage channels that were constructed to manage the flow of water away from the monument's vulnerable base. These hydraulic features, documented by Lena and his team, are evidence that the builders understood the Sphinx's geological vulnerability from the very beginning. The soft limestone of the lower body was already susceptible to water damage when the monument was carved. The drainage channels were an engineering response to a known problem, an attempt to protect the monument from the very forces that would, over millennia, erode it from within. The Sphinx Temple, discovered in 1925 during the Barrezes excavation, is among the most mysterious structures at Giza. It is built from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, quarried from the Sphinx enclosure. The temple's walls were originally faced with red granite from Aswan, which has largely been stripped away, leaving the bare limestone core exposed. The interior consists of a central court surrounded by pillars, with niches that may have once held statues. The temple's alignment is significant. It is oriented not to the cardinal points, like most Egyptian temples, but to the Sphinx itself, with its axis aligned to the statue's gaze. The temple was designed to interact with the Sphinx, not with the compass. No inscription in the Sphinx temple identifies its builder or its purpose. Like the Sphinx itself, the temple is anonymous. Its massive blocks, its granite facing, its precise alignment, all speak of a major royal commission. But the commissioner remains unnamed. The temple is yet another piece of the Sphinx puzzle, a substantial, sophisticated structure that tells us much about the resources and organization of its builders, and nothing about their identity. The Valley Temple of Khafre, by contrast, is securely attributed. It bears inscriptions and contains the diorite statue of Khafre that Mariette discovered. Its connection to Khafre's pyramid via the causeway is undisputed, and its physical proximity to the Sphinx Temple, the two structures share a wall, is the strongest piece of spatial evidence linking the Sphinx to Khafre's building program. If the Sphinx Temple was part of Khafre's complex, then the Sphinx was too. and the shared wall between the two temples makes the connection very difficult to deny. But very difficult to deny is not the same as proven. And the Sphinx, as we have seen, resists proof with a stubbornness that has outlasted every generation of investigators. The ancient Egyptians' own uncertainty about the Sphinx is itself revealing. The dream stele of Thutmose IV, erected around 1401 BC, treats the Sphinx as an independent deity, Horemakhet, Horus of the horizon, without any clear reference to a human builder. This suggests that by the 18th dynasty, roughly 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, the Egyptians themselves had lost track of who built it. The monument had outlived its own history. It had become, in the minds of the people who lived beside it, a thing without an origin, a divine presence that had always been there, emerging from the bedrock like a natural feature of the landscape. This loss of historical memory within Egypt itself is perhaps the most significant piece of evidence in the entire debate. If the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, people who lived in the same culture, spoke a descendant of the same language, worshipped evolved forms of the same gods, could not identify the Sphinx's builder, what chance do we have, 3,500 years further removed? The Sphinx's anonymity is not a gap in the archaeological record that might someday be filled. It is a feature of the monument's history, a consequence of the deep time that separates us from the Fourth Dynasty, a distance so vast that even the civilization that built the Sphinx could not bridge it. Slow down. Step back from the evidence. Step back from the theories. Step back from the geological strata and the architectural alignments and the forensic facial reconstructions, and consider what the Sphinx actually tells us, not about the Fourth Dynasty, but about the nature of human aspiration. A group of people, roughly 4,500 years ago, looked at a ridge of limestone protruding from the edge of a desert plateau and decided to turn it into a lion with a human face. They did not build it from blocks, like the pyramids. They carved it in place, a subtractive act, removing everything that was not the Sphinx, leaving only the form they saw in the stone. This is sculpture in its purest sense. Not construction but revelation. Not adding material but taking it away. The Sphinx was always in the bedrock. The carvers simply freed it. This image, the Sphinx as something freed from the rock rather than imposed upon it, has a resonance that goes beyond archaeology. It echoes Michelangelo's famous description of sculpture as the art of removing everything that is not the figure. It connects the Fourth Dynasty carvers to every sculptor who has ever looked at a block of raw material and seen the form inside it. The difference is one of scale. Michelangelo carved the David from a single block of marble 5 meters tall. The Fourth Dynasty carvers revealed the Sphinx from a ridge of limestone 73 meters long. The ambition is the same. The scale is incomprehensible, and the ambition raises a question that no amount of geological analysis can answer. What kind of people look at a rock and see a god? What kind of civilization looks at a landscape and imagines it populated with divine forms? What kind of mind conceives of a monument so large that it can only be appreciated from a distance? A sculpture designed to be seen from the valley floor, from the causeways, from the temples below, but never from close range, where the rough surface and the soft stone would betray the artistry that the distance conceals. The Sphinx was not designed for close inspection. It was designed for impact. It was designed to be seen from the east, from the Nile Valley, from the floodplain, from the approach routes that pilgrims and visitors would have used to reach the Giza plateau. From that distance, the Sphinx would have been magnificent, a massive leonine form, painted in vivid red, its headdress striped in blue and yellow, its face staring eastward with an expression of calm, divine authority. The rough texture of the limestone, the layered strata, the soft spots and the hard spots, none of this would have been visible from below. Only the shape, only the form, only the idea. And the idea was powerful enough to sustain the monument for millennia. The paint faded, the surface eroded, the features softened, but the idea, a lion with a human face, crouched on the edge of the desert, watching the sunrise, endured. It endured because it was larger than any individual, larger than any name, larger than any dynasty. The Sphinx is not a portrait of Khafre or Khufu or Djedefre. It is a portrait of kingship itself, of the concept of a divine ruler, half human and half animal, mediating between the world of the living and the world of the gods. This is not science fiction. This is theology, rendered in stone, at a scale that dwarfs every subsequent attempt. No civilization has ever built a theological monument of this scale in a single piece. The Colossus of Rhodes was assembled from bronze plates. The Statue of Liberty was built from copper sheets over an iron frame. The Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro is reinforced concrete. Only the Sphinx is monolithic, carved from a single mass of stone, inseparable from the earth on which it sits. The Sphinx is the earth. It is part of the planet. It cannot be moved, cannot be dismantled, cannot be separated from the bedrock that formed it millions of years before anyone thought to carve it. And that permanence, that geological permanence, older than any human intention, is what gives the Sphinx its power. The pyramids could, in theory, be dismantled. Block by block, they could be taken apart. The Sphinx cannot. It is the bedrock. To destroy the Sphinx, you would have to destroy the plateau itself. And the plateau, the Eocene limestone laid down in a shallow sea roughly 40 million years ago, is not going anywhere. Let that sink in. The Sphinx is built from the earth itself. It is not a building placed on the ground. It is the ground shaped, revealed, given form. And when we look at the Sphinx, we are looking not just at a monument but at a piece of the planet, reshaped by human hands, expressing a human idea, but made of material that preceded humanity by tens of millions of years. The rock does not care who carved it. The rock does not care whose face it wears. The rock simply is. Ancient beyond comprehension, enduring beyond imagination, indifferent to the names and the theories and the debates that the tiny, brief species called humans projects upon it. The builders of the Sphinx understood this, even if they could not have articulated it in these terms. They chose bedrock because bedrock lasts. They chose limestone because limestone endures. They chose the Giza plateau because the plateau was high, dry, visible, and permanent. Every choice they made was a bet on durability, and the bets paid off. The Sphinx has outlasted every dynasty, every empire, every religion, every language that has existed since it was carved. It has survived the rise and fall of Rome, the Arab conquest, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and the modern Egyptian state. It has survived Napoleon and Nelson and 2 world wars and the construction of the Aswan Dam. It has survived everything that human history has thrown at it. And it will survive us. This is the deeper truth that the Sphinx reveals. Not who built it, not why, but what it means to build something from the earth itself, to take the planet's own material and shape it into a form that expresses a human idea. The idea may be forgotten, the name may be lost, the paint may fade and the nose may fall off, and the beard may crumble into the sand. But the form endures, because the form is the earth, and the earth endures. We build our monuments from concrete and steel and glass, materials that are manufactured, artificial, separated from the earth. These materials are strong but temporary. Concrete degrades, steel corrodes, glass shatters. A modern skyscraper has a design lifespan of perhaps 100 years. The Sphinx has already lasted 45 centuries. The difference is not in the skill of the builders. It is in the material. The Sphinx was built from the earth. Our monuments are built from what we extract from the earth. And the extracted materials, separated from their geological context, are more fragile than the context they came from. There is a lesson here, a lesson about permanence, about material, about the relationship between human ambition and planetary reality. The Sphinx teaches it silently, every day, as the sun rises over its shoulder and the tourists gather at its feet and the sand blows against its flanks. The lesson is this: if you want to build something that lasts, do not build on the earth. Build from the earth. Do not impose your monument on the landscape. Reveal it from within. Do not add material. Subtract it. Find the form that is already in the rock. Free it, and then step back and let the rock do what rock does best: endure. The builders of the Sphinx understood this. They freed the lion from the limestone. They gave it a human face. They pointed it at the sunrise. And then they walked away, apparently without signing their work, apparently without leaving a name, apparently without any concern that future generations might not know who they were. The monument was enough. The form was enough. The earth, shaped into a divine image, was enough. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the anonymity of the Sphinx is not a loss but a statement. The most eloquent statement the fourth dynasty ever made. Not I, Khafre, built this, but simply, this is here, this is permanent. This will watch the sunrise long after every name has been forgotten. The Sphinx does not need a builder's name. The Sphinx needs only the sunrise. And the sunrise, unlike names and dynasties and civilizations, has never failed to arrive. And there is a grief in this recognition, a quiet, specific archaeological grief that is different from the grief of a lost civilization or a destroyed city. The Sphinx has not been destroyed. It has not been lost. It stands in plain sight, visited by millions, photographed billions of times, known to virtually every human being on the planet. And yet we do not know its story. We do not know the name of the person who imagined it. We do not know the name of the master sculptor who directed its carving. We do not know the name of the foreman who supervised the workers. We do not know the names of the workers who spent months or years in the quarry trench, cutting away thousands of tons of stone, shaping the paws and the haunches and the Neem's headdress with copper chisels and wooden mallets and the patient, grinding persistence that monumental sculpture demands. These people existed. They were real. They had names. They lived and worked and ate and slept on the Giza plateau, within sight of the monument they were creating. And they are gone, not just dead, which is the fate of everyone, but erased. Their names are not on the Sphinx. Their names are not in the quarry. Their names are not in the workers' village. They gave their labor to the most famous monument on earth, and the monument does not remember them. This is the human cost of the Sphinx's silence, not the loss of a king's name. Kings are remembered by their pyramids, their temples, their inscriptions, their place in the king lists. The loss of everyone else, the architects, the artists, the laborers, the priests who consecrated the monument, the families who fed the workers, the communities that supported the entire enterprise, all gone, all anonymous, all absorbed into the bedrock of the plateau, as invisible as the limestone that was removed to create the Sphinx's form. We mourn for the workers at the pyramids. We know, from Lena's excavation of the workers' village, that they were well fed, that they received medical care, that they were organized into named work gangs with a esprit de corps. But we know these things from the village, not from the pyramids themselves. The pyramids do not mention their builders. The Sphinx does not mention its carvers. The monuments stand. The people vanish. And this vanishing is not ancient history. It is a process that continues in every generation, in every civilization, in every culture. The names of the builders are always the first to be lost. The name of the patron, the king, the pharaoh, the president sometimes survives. The names of the architects, the engineers, the workers, almost never. The Sphinx is not an anomaly, it is the norm. It is the standard condition of every monument that has ever been built. The structure endures, the names disappear. The Sphinx simply demonstrates this condition more completely, more visibly, and on a larger scale than any other monument in history. And that demonstration is itself a kind of lesson, a lesson about what matters and what does not. The Sphinx suggests that the name does not matter. The form matters. The idea matters. The act of carving, of freeing the divine image from the rock, of shaping the earth into meaning, matters. The name of the person who gave the order is a biographical detail. The monument is something else, something larger, something that transcends the individual and speaks to the species. The Sphinx does not say, Khafre was here. The Sphinx says, humanity was here. And that is a more powerful statement, more durable, more universal, more true than any personal inscription could ever be. Let that sink in. The Sphinx's anonymity may be its greatest strength. A named monument is limited. It belongs to its builder. It memorializes a single ego. It is an act of personal commemoration. An anonymous monument belongs to everyone. It memorializes not a person, but a capability, the capability of human beings, to look at raw stones and see a god, to take the formless earth and give it form, to create meaning from material. The Sphinx, unnamed, unclaimed, unattributed, is the most democratic monument in the world. It belongs to no one, and therefore it belongs to everyone. The comparison to modern monuments is instructive. Consider the Washington Monument, the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty. Each of these is named, not for a builder, but for a concept, a nation, an idea. Each transcends its individual creator. Each belongs to the culture that produced it, not to the person who signed the contract. The Sphinx achieved this status 5,000 years ago, not by design perhaps, but by consequence. The loss of the builder's name freed the monument from individual biography and released it into collective meaning. And collective meaning is what the Sphinx has become. It is not Khafre's statue the way the Great Pyramid is Khufu's pyramid. It is simply the Sphinx. It is an archetype, a form so primal, so recognizable, so embedded in human consciousness that it transcends the culture that created it. The word Sphinx itself has passed from Egyptian through Greek, through Latin, through French, through English, accumulating meanings at every stage, from strangler to enigma to mystery to inscrutable. The Sphinx has become a metaphor, a concept, an adjective. To be Sphinx-like is to be silent, knowing, and unrevealing. The monument has escaped its archaeological context and entered the language. No other ancient monument has accomplished this. The Great Pyramid is admired for its size. The Parthenon is admired for its proportions. The Colosseum is admired for its engineering. But the Sphinx is admired for its mystery. It is famous not for what we know about it, but for what we do not know. And this distinction between fame based on knowledge and fame based on ignorance is what makes the Sphinx unique in the history of human construction. We know less about the Sphinx than we know about almost any other major monument from the ancient world. And yet the Sphinx is more famous than almost any other monument from the ancient world. The relationship is not coincidental, it is causal. The mystery is the fame, the silence is the attraction. The absence of answers is the reason people come, not just to see a statue, but to stand in the presence of a question that has been asked for 45 centuries and has never been answered. And that question, who built this and why, is at its deepest level a question about us, about our need to know, about our compulsion to attribute, to explain, to categorize, to file everything in the correct drawer of the correct cabinet. The Sphinx resists this compulsion. It will not be filed. It will not be categorized. It insists on remaining open, unresolved, uncertain. And in doing so, it teaches us something about the limits of knowledge, about the fact that some things, however intensely studied, however thoroughly investigated, simply will not yield their secrets. The Sphinx is not a failure of archaeology, it is a success of mystery. It demonstrates that the human past contains depths that our methods cannot always reach, that there are questions older than our discipline, older than our civilization, older than our species' capacity to record its own thoughts. The Sphinx was carved before most of the world's writing systems were invented. It was carved before most of the world's great civilizations existed. It was carved in an era so remote that the very concept of history, the idea that events can be recorded, preserved, and transmitted to the future, was in its infancy, and it carries the silence of that era with it, into our own time, undiluted and unbroken. And the question extends beyond the Sphinx to every monument that has outlived its context. What does a building mean when the civilization that built it has vanished? What does a sculpture represent when the religion that animated it has been replaced? The Sphinx is not unique in facing these questions. The Easter Island Moai, the Stonehenge megaliths, the Nazca lines, all share the same condition of survived form with lost meaning. But the Sphinx is the largest, the most famous, and the most studied example. And the fact that even the most intensive study has failed to provide definitive answers tells us something important about the relationship between monuments and meaning. Meaning is fragile, form is durable. This is the Sphinx's lesson, repeated in limestone every day for 45 centuries. The form endures because it is made of rock. The meaning dissolves because it is made of culture, of beliefs, institutions, languages, and traditions that change with every generation and vanish with every civilizational transition. The Sphinx was carved from a material that can last millions of years. It was given a meaning that lasted, at most, a few centuries. The mismatch between the permanence of the medium and the impermanence of the message is the Sphinx's defining tragedy and its defining power, because the impermanence of the message is what creates the mystery. A monument with a known builder, a known date, and a known purpose is interesting but finite. It can be catalogued. It can be explained. It can be filed away. A monument without these things, a monument whose builder is uncertain, whose date is debated, whose purpose is unknown, is infinite. It cannot be catalogued because it keeps generating new questions. It cannot be explained because every explanation produces new objections. It cannot be filed away because it refuses to stay in one place in the intellectual landscape. The Sphinx is infinite in this sense. It has been generating questions for 45 centuries. It will generate them for 45 more. And the questions it generates about the nature of the past, about the limits of knowledge, about the relationship between human ambition and geological time, are not archaeological questions. They are existential ones. They are questions about what it means to build, to create, to aspire to permanence in a universe that grants permanence to stone but not to names, to form but not to meaning, day to the earth but not to the creatures who walk upon it. The Sphinx knows this. It has always known this. And it sits there still, the earth made into art, the rock made into meaning, the plateau made into a question, waiting, watching, enduring, silent. The sun rises, the Sphinx faces east, and the oldest, largest, most famous unanswered question in the world begins another day. Stand at the eastern edge of the Sphinx enclosure, just after dawn. The sun is rising directly ahead, climbing over the apartment blocks of Cairo that now crowd the edge of the plateau. The Sphinx is behind you. You are seeing what the Sphinx sees. The same direction it has faced, without interruption, for 45 centuries. In the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great's army passed within sight of this monument. In the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar stood here. In 1800, Napoleon's savants sketched the Sphinx from this angle, its body still buried in sand. In 1925, Barré's workers cleared the last of the sand from the pores. In 1969, the Apollo astronauts could see the Giza plateau, the Sphinx and the pyramids from orbit. The Sphinx has watched all of it, the rise of empires, the fall of empires, the invention of writing, of printing, of photography, of spaceflight. The Sphinx has watched the entire recorded history of humanity unfold in front of it, and it has said nothing. This is the Sphinx's final and most profound teaching, that permanence and understanding are not the same thing. A monument can last forever and still be misunderstood. A sculpture can survive 5 millennia and still be unidentified. Permanence preserves form. It does not preserve meaning. The Sphinx has preserved its form, the lion's body, the royal head, the eastern gaze, with extraordinary fidelity, but it has not preserved its meaning. The theological program that gave it purpose, the cosmological framework that gave it significance, the political context that gave it urgency, all of this is gone. What remains is the shape. And the shape, without the story, is a question. This has implications for every monument we build today. We assume that if we build something large enough, durable enough, prominent enough, its meaning will be self-evident to future generations. The Sphinx suggests otherwise. The Sphinx was large, it was durable, it was prominent, and within 1,000 years of its construction, its meaning had already been reinterpreted, its builder forgotten, its original function replaced by a theology that its creators would not have recognized. The monument survived, the meaning did not. We are making the same assumption with our own monuments. We build war memorials and assume they will always be understood as expressions of grief. We build national monuments and assume they will always be interpreted as expressions of patriotism. We build public sculptures and assume they will always be read the way we intended. The Sphinx teaches us that these assumptions are unfounded. Future generations will interpret our monuments according to their own needs, their own beliefs, their own cosmologies. They will project their own meanings onto our forms, and our intentions, however clearly we inscribe them, however carefully we document them, will eventually be forgotten, reinterpreted, or misunderstood. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of humility. The Sphinx teaches us to be humble about our monuments, to recognize that what we build is not permanent in meaning, only in form, that the stories we tell about our monuments will change with every generation, that the names we inscribe on them will eventually be worn smooth by time, and that the most enduring thing about any monument is not what it says but what it looks like, not the text but the form, not the inscription but the shape. The 4th dynasty understood this intuitively. They built in forms, pyramids, mastabas, sphinxes, that communicated through shape, through proportion, through orientation, through the basic geometry of mass and space. These forms transcend language. They transcend culture. A pyramid looks like a pyramid in any century, to any observer, regardless of whether the observer can read hieroglyphics or understand Egyptian theology. The form communicates independently of the text, and because the form communicates independently, it survives the loss of the text. The Sphinx is the ultimate expression of this principle. It has lost everything that can be lost: name, paint, nose, beard, inscription, context, meaning. It has kept everything that cannot be lost: form, mass, orientation, presence. And the presence, the sheer physical fact of a 73-meter limestone sculpture staring east from the edge of a desert plateau, is enough. It is enough to fascinate, enough to inspire, enough to make every visitor, regardless of their culture or their century, stop and stare and wonder. That wonder is the Sphinx's purpose, not the wonder that the Fourth Dynasty intended. Whatever theological or cosmological program animated the original commission, but the wonder that the monument generates on its own, independently of its original context, across every era and every culture. The Sphinx has become its own purpose. Its mystery is its meaning. Its silence is its message, and its survival, damaged, eroded, anonymous, inexplicable, is its triumph. There is a final parallel worth drawing, one that connects the Sphinx to the condition of knowledge itself in the modern world. We live in an era of unprecedented information, petabytes of data produced every day, archived on servers, backed up in the cloud, indexed by algorithms, accessible from any device on the planet. We assume that this avalanche of information makes our civilization more knowable, more documented, more permanent than any previous one. The Sphinx suggests we are wrong. The Fourth Dynasty produced the most monumental building program in human history. They quarried millions of tons of stone. They employed thousands of workers. They operated an industrial logistics system that would not be rivaled for millennia. And yet the largest single sculpture they produced, a monument 73 meters long, visible from space, carries no record of its creation. The information was either never recorded or was recorded and lost. Either way, the result is the same: silence. Our own civilization's records are stored on magnetic media with a demonstrated lifespan of decades, not millennia. Our cloud servers depend on continuous power, continuous cooling, and continuous institutional support. Our digital archives require format migration every few years to remain readable. The Sphinx has survived for 45 centuries with no maintenance, no power, no institutional support of any kind. It has survived by doing nothing, by simply being stone in a desert. Our archives will not survive 45 centuries. They will not survive 45 decades without active intervention. This is the Sphinx's final, uncomfortable lesson. We have more information than any civilization in history. We also have less durable information than any civilization in history. The Sphinx, carved in stone, will outlast every hard drive on Earth. The Sphinx, silent and inscriptionless, will outlast every digital archive. The monument that has lost its builder's name will endure longer than the systems we have designed to prevent the loss of names. The stone does not care, the stone endures. And the Sphinx, the question carved in stone, the mystery made permanent, the enigma that has outlasted every answer, endures with it. We build monuments to answer questions. The Sphinx teaches us that the most powerful monuments are the ones that ask them, and the questions the Sphinx asks are not trivial. They are the deepest questions that any civilization must face. Who are we? What do we build? What do we leave behind? And when everything we have written has been erased, when every name we have carved has been worn smooth, when every institution we have created has collapsed, what will remain? The Sphinx answers: form, shape, mass. The earth itself reshaped by human ambition. The lion and the king merged in limestone facing the sunrise. Not a sentence, not a name, not a theory, just a presence, massive, enduring, silent, that says, without words, that someone was here. That someone looked at a ridge of rock and saw something divine. That someone had the vision, the resources, and the will to free that vision from the stone. The Sphinx does not tell us who that someone was. It tells us only that they existed, that they imagined, that they carved, and that what they carved has outlasted everything else they did: their politics, their economics, their wars, their daily lives, their deaths, their names, all gone. The Sphinx remains. And perhaps that is the honest answer to the question posed by the title of this documentary. Who built the Sphinx? Someone. Someone with extraordinary vision and extraordinary resources and an extraordinary understanding of the permanence of stone. Someone who lived roughly 4,500 years ago on the banks of the Nile in a civilization that was inventing the very concept of monumental construction. Someone who looked east, toward the rising sun, and decided that the horizon needed a guardian. We call that someone Khafre because the evidence points most strongly in his direction. But the name is in a sense secondary. What matters is not the name but the act of carving, the act of imagining, the act of looking at the earth and seeing within it the form of a god. That act belongs not to one king but to a civilization, to the collective imagination of the Fourth Dynasty, expressed in the most enduring medium available to them. The Sphinx is not Khafre's monument. The Sphinx is Egypt's monument. It is humanity's monument. And it will continue to be. Long after every theory has been proposed and debated and replaced. Long after every scholar has published and been forgotten. Long after the last tourist has taken the last photograph. The Sphinx will be there, watching the sun rise, saying nothing, outlasting us all. There is one more reflection that the Sphinx demands. It is a reflection not about the monument, but about the discipline that studies it, about Egyptology, about archaeology, about the enterprise of trying to understand the past through its material remains. The Sphinx has been studied by some of the most brilliant minds in the history of archaeological science. Petrie, Reisner, Lena, Hawass, Hassan, each brought decades of expertise. Each applied the most advanced methods of their era. Each contributed essential pieces to the puzzle. And yet the puzzle remains incomplete. Not because these scholars failed, not because their methods were inadequate, but because some puzzles, posed by some monuments, at some distance of time, are inherently resistant to solution. The evidence is too fragmentary. The gap between the present and the past is too wide. The stone has been too thoroughly eroded, repaired, and reinterpreted. This is a humbling recognition for any discipline. Science is built on the assumption that questions have answers, that with sufficient evidence, sufficient analysis, and sufficient ingenuity, any problem can be solved. The Sphinx challenges this assumption. It suggests that there are problems that cannot be solved, not because the solution is complex, but because the evidence is gone. The information that would resolve the debate was carved in stone or painted in pigment, or inscribed on a stele, and the stone has weathered, the pigment has faded, and the stele has cracked at precisely the wrong point. The answer existed, it was physical, it was real, and it has been destroyed by time. This is not a failure of science. It is a lesson about the limits of science, about the irreducible uncertainty that accompanies any investigation of the deep past. The Sphinx teaches us that certainty is not always available, that the honest answer is sometimes we do not know, and that we do not know is not a defeat but a recognition of the immensity of the past, the fragility of the record, and the courage required to admit that some things may be permanently beyond our reach. The Sphinx does not mind our uncertainty. The Sphinx has been uncertain about for 45 centuries. It has been misidentified, misattributed, mythologized, and mystified by every culture that has encountered it. It has been buried in sand and dug out again. It has been worshipped as a god, studied as a monument, and photographed as a tourist attraction. And through all of it, through every theory, every excavation, every debate, the Sphinx has remained exactly what it has always been: a lion with a human face, crouched on the bedrock, facing east, watching the sunrise, saying nothing. And so the investigation continues. New technologies emerge: muon tomography, LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, satellite interferometry, each offering the possibility of new discoveries beneath the sand and within the stone. New scholars arrive, trained in new methods, asking new questions, bringing new perspectives to a monument that has resisted every previous attempt at final interpretation. And the monument itself continues to erode, slowly, measurably, irreversibly, revealing new surfaces, new strata, new geological features that may contain clues invisible to previous generations. The Sphinx is not a closed case. It is an open investigation, one of the longest-running investigations in the history of human inquiry. and the fact that it remains open after more than a century of modern scientific study is itself a testament to the monument's extraordinary capacity to resist explanation. The Sphinx was built to endure, and it has endured, not just as a physical form, but as an intellectual challenge, a cultural symbol, and a philosophical provocation that shows no sign of being resolved. And perhaps that resistance is the most fitting legacy for a monument carved from the earth itself. A form that belongs to the planet as much as it belongs to any human civilization, that endures because the bedrock endures, that speaks through silence rather than inscription, and that will continue to face the eastern horizon long after every theory about its origins has been proposed, debated, revised, and forgotten. So who built the Great Sphinx of Giza, and why? The honest answer, the answer that the evidence supports, the answer that the scholarship has earned after more than a century of investigation, is this. The Sphinx was almost certainly carved during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, most probably during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BC according to current scholarly estimates. It was carved from a natural limestone outcrop on the eastern edge of the Giza plateau, as part of the same construction program that produced Khafre's pyramid, his valley temple, his causeway, and the Sphinx temple. The limestone blocks removed during the carving were used to build the temples. The workers who carved it were housed in the same village that supported the pyramid builders. The monument was oriented to face due east, toward the rising sun, and it may have served a solar function within the theological program of Khafre's pyramid complex. That is the probable answer, but it is not the certain answer. The certain answer does not exist. No contemporary inscription names the Sphinx's builder. No dedicatory text explains its purpose. No royal decree records its commissioning. The evidence is circumstantial, strong, cumulative, persuasive, but circumstantial. And the possibility that the Sphinx was built by Khufu, or Jedefre, or an unknown 4th dynasty king, cannot be excluded on the evidence currently available. The purpose of the Sphinx is equally uncertain. It may have been a divine guardian, a monumental representation of the king as a lion god, protecting the entrance to the royal necropolis. It may have been a solar icon, a symbol of the king's relationship to the sun, positioned on the eastern horizon to participate in the daily cycle of death and rebirth. It may have been a political statement, a demonstration of the king's power and resources, visible from the Nile Valley, announcing the presence of a divine ruler to every traveller who approached from the east. It may have been all of these things simultaneously. Or it may have been something else entirely, something we cannot reconstruct, because the theological framework that gave it meaning has been lost. What we can say with certainty is this. The Sphinx was built by people who understood the permanence of stone, who knew that the bedrock of the Giza plateau would outlast any other material they could work with, who chose to carve their monument in place from the living rock rather than build it from blocks that could be dismantled, who created a form, the lion with the human head, that had no precedent and would have no equal, who gave that form the most prominent position on the most prominent plateau in the most prominent cemetery in Egypt, and who then, apparently, walked away without leaving a single written record of what they had done. The Sphinx sits on the Giza plateau today much as it sat 45 centuries ago, reduced, eroded, repaired, but recognizable. Its face stares east, its paws stretch forward, its body crouches against the bedrock from which it was carved. The paint is gone, the nose is gone, the beard is gone, the name is gone, but the form remains, the lion remains, the human head remains, the gaze remains, and every morning, as it has every morning for roughly 1,640,000 mornings, the sun rises over the Sphinx's shoulder and climbs into the Egyptian sky. The Sphinx watches. The Sphinx has always watched. The Sphinx will continue to watch through whatever centuries remain, through whatever civilizations come and go, through whatever questions are asked and whatever answers are given, and whatever mysteries are solved and whatever mysteries endure. The sun rises, the Sphinx watches, and the question remains, who built this? Why? The stone does not answer. The stone has never answered. The stone will never answer. And that, the silence, the permanence, the unyielding refusal to explain itself, is perhaps the most eloquent thing the Sphinx has ever said. It sits there still, 73 meters of limestone bedrock, carved into the shape of a question that has been asked for 4,500 years and will be asked for 4,500 more. A lion's body and a human head, a king's headdress and a god's silence. The most famous sculpture on earth, the most anonymous. Look at it, look at the face, look at the eastern sky behind it, and ask yourself, in 45 centuries, what will remain of us? The Sphinx already knows the answer. It has always known, and it is not telling.